This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Developers, are you ready? It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. When you can make faster decisions, there's no telling what you'll create. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Hello everyone, this is Felienne for Software Engineering Radio. Today with me on the show is Gavis Hughson. He graduated from Princeton University with a degree in computer science in 2015, and he is the founder of Byte that helps software engineers interview for jobs at top tech companies. He is also the author of Dynamic Programming Interviews, the ebook that helps anyone succeed at dynamic programming interviews. Welcome to the show, Gavin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the topic of today's show is technical interviews. And let's start with the basics. Can you take us to the typical process that a company would go to if they're hiring someone?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we tend to work with primarily people who are looking for jobs at companies like a Google or a Facebook or something like that, sort of the high level tech companies. And there's generally a process where, you're going to start by either you apply, or a lot of times if you already have experience as a software engineer, a recruiter might actually reach out to you. So that's a really good reason why you should have a good LinkedIn profile, because you can kind of put yourself out there. But then after that, you're probably going to get on a call with a recruiter, and they're just going to try and learn a little bit more about what your background is and how that relates to the role, and make sure that just fundamentally you're a good fit. And they're not necessarily going to probably test you on anything technical, but then after that, you're going to have a technical screen of some sort. So we've been seeing a lot more companies doing online tech screens. So, you're going to go on and it'll essentially be like using LeetCode, except they'll use whatever platform they're using. Then after that, if you pass that, you'll have a phone screen where you're going to solve some technical questions. And then finally, if you pass through all that, you're going to end up in an on-site interview. So you're going to go and you're going to have maybe 4 or 5 interviews over the course of a day. And depending on the level, those are going to be, it's going to depend how many of those are like technical interviews versus behavioral versus system design. Because those are sort of the 3 things that you're going to see. And obviously this process varies a lot from company to company. So I don't want to say that all companies are like this, but those are sort of at least the components that you can expect to see as you're going through the interview process.
Yeah, so typically there would be a number of steps. It's definitely not just the one job interview, but there are a bunch of them. And some parts can be very technical and other parts can be more about culture fit. And typically, even though there are differences between companies, those both ingredients exist in the whole process, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, there are those little variances, but what I really try and encourage people to think about is the fact that the fundamentals don't change from company to company, and even from type of interview to type of interview. So for example, if you're doing an online assessment versus a phone screen versus an on-site interview, if they're all technical interviews, it's the same thought process that applies. And so you want to learn, if you can learn how to be strategic about approaching those types of problems, then that really applies to everything that you're doing. And it's not like you're just saying, okay, let me go, I have an Amazon technical screen coming up, so let me go look at specifically how to prepare for that. You want to think more generally, how can I prepare for these technical problems as a whole, and then apply that to the specific company that you're going to be interviewing at.
Yeah, so let's zoom into this technical interview part, because that's the thing we're most interested in this episode. Even within technical interviews, there are quite a lot of differences. Of course, the canonical thing that people think of is like the whiteboard interview, where you're being asked to do an algorithm without a computer. But nowadays, I think it's also common to do coding challenges on the computer, maybe even, as you mentioned, also online before or as part of the interview process. What are different types of technical interviews that exist?
Yeah, there are quite a few different ways that you can be asked the question. So again, I would go back to the fact that fundamentally you're being asked to do the same thing regardless. It's more the medium that's changing. So like a lot of times the first step is going to be some online screen. So there's no other person involved. You're literally just going on the computer and they give you a prompt and you have to solve the problem, and maybe you have 60 or 90 minutes and you have one or two problems, and then there will be automated tests. So think like a hacker rank problem or a LeetCode code problem. And so that's sort of usually that first step. Then you might be asked to do a phone screen, where in that case you are also going to be coding on a computer, but you're going to be using a shared editor. So a lot of people like to use Collab Edit, or if you're doing a Google interview, you're going to have to use Google Docs, which kind of sucks. Or there are a bunch of other tools out there, and some of them let you compile the code, some of them let you do syntax highlighting, different stuff, and some of them don't. And so with that, what you really want to be prepared for is you want to be prepared for, unless you know what platform they're using ahead of time, you want to be prepared for the fact that you're not going to have all the tools that you're used to. And then, of course, when you're going into the company, there are a bunch of different things you could see. So you could see that whiteboarding interview, which is obviously still the most common. I've also seen more things like debugging interviews, or Google, I believe now gives you the option to code on a computer. It's sort of same sort of interview, but they'll give you a computer with an IDE. And the thing to be careful with that is that sounds like, oh, obviously that's the best choice. But realize that you don't get to choose what tech setup they have, how that computer is configured. So realize that even though that sounds like it might be a great thing, you're kind of going to get shoehorned into whatever they have available for you. So it's just something to be careful about with that as well, because you don't want to assume that you're going to be able to use your particular IDE with your, all of your keyboard shortcuts and everything, and then get in there and it's a totally different thing. So those are a couple of the different ways that you might be approaching these problems, but they're fundamentally the same problems, and you're just put into a different setting to have to answer them.
And then what do companies look at? So what are they interested in? Are they interested in people that just get it right? Or are they looking at what is your process? And even if you don't manage to get the answer right, then they look at what is the stuff you do? What do you Google for? What are you looking for? Is that something that people do? Or is it really, if you don't get the answer right, then you're out?
So I like to think about it like those math tests that you have in grade school where they give you partial credit for showing your work, because it really is something where if we take a step back here and think about what is the goal of the interview. The goal of the interview is to learn whether this is a person that I would like to work with, whether this is a person that I think would be a good fit for our company, and specifically in this case, a good fit from a technical standpoint. And so what that means is that, you do have to really show your work and show how you are actually getting to that answer. So certainly just showing the perfect answer is not usually going to be enough, or you're definitely shooting yourself in the foot, because there is no room for error there. Now, beyond that, it's really a range. So it depends a lot on what your specific interviewer is looking for. But I've seen, I was just speaking with a student the other day who said, hey, I did my Google phone screen the other day and I really felt like I screwed it up. And then they just called me and asked me to come do an on-site. And so it can be really hard to actually self-evaluate how you're doing. And it's really the case that there is such a broad range of the expectations of the interviewers that it's impossible to say generically, you have to have an answer that is this degree of optimized, or you have to have an answer that is this degree of correct, right? Because it's such a spectrum. But in a broad scope, the way that I think about it as an interviewer is I sort of have a cutoff point. Like I've asked the same question again and again. And so I have an idea of here's roughly where I expect a good candidate to end up. And if you get beyond that, if you do more, then obviously you're a very good candidate. And if you do a lot less than that, you would have to make up for it in other ways. You would have to be a really compelling candidate who I really connected with and really wanted to work with, or really had great experience other than that, for me to want to move you along to that next round. But there's that rough cutoff, and that cutoff is not necessarily finding the most optimal solution. That cutoff could be, I want you to get to at least a certain point in the problem, or I want you to, discover this property of the question that I'm asking you, sort of thing. So it really depends a lot on the problem and the interviewer, but generally speaking, you want to be careful of the mistake that I see people make is that they think that, oh, I didn't find the perfect solution and I'm kind of struggling with this problem, and therefore my interviewer is automatically going to fail me. Or they gave me a hint, and so they're automatically going to fail me. And then they start to get in their head and they start to say, oh, well, I already screwed this up. So they end up flubbing the interview, even though if they had just stuck with it, they would have been fine, because that's actually what the interviewer was expecting. So hopefully that sort of gives a little bit more context around that anyway.
Okay, so where were we? We were at, what if a candidate fails, then when do they fail? Is it really a hit or miss? But you said no. Also, I look at the process, and there are these things that I might look at, and if people get to a certain extent, then they still get some grades for showing their work.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's, one of those things that a lot of times I think that people go into the interview with this expectation that I have to do X, or else I'm going to automatically fail. And that's very much not the case. It's there's a lot more nuance in it than that. And so even if you don't feel like you're doing well, you can actually pass on to the next round of the interview. You just need to keep sort of mentally with it, keep mentally on your game, even if you're not feeling great about it.
Yeah. So would you also be looking at soft skills of a candidate? I would not necessarily soft skills interview, but I think in a coding exercise, you can also see persistence, maybe how patient are people with challenging questions, how long do they keep pursuing a certain path until they backtrack and see it's not the right path. So are you mainly focusing on the technical skills, or do you also look at those soft skills that are very related to technical skills?
This is an interesting one, because I think it's something that what I've found from experience is that generally the thing that screws people up is the technical side. So I've really focused, when I work with people, I tend to focus more on that. And what I see, at least, obviously we can talk about behavioral interviews as well, which that's a totally different beast unto itself. But if we're talking about the technical interview specifically, the way that I generally look at it is that the technical skills are the make or break part, and the social and sort of behavioral stuff is more of the icing on the cake. So that's the thing that can push you one way or the other if you're on the fence if the interviewer is on the fence about a candidate. Like if I really like you, and this is what I was saying before about how there is some gray area in exactly what I would and wouldn't accept. Because if you're sort of just at that point where I think that, you're basically at that cutoff point and I really like you, I'm much more likely to push you ahead and say, okay, well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, give her the benefit of the doubt, and say, let's give them another interview and see what other people think. Because obviously you're going to have to pass multiple interviews, but lots of times we have one that doesn't go as well as the others. And so if I really like you, I'm much more likely to say, okay, I'm essentially going to defer to everyone else because I thought their technical skills were good enough. Not the best that I've seen, but they're good enough that if they did well elsewhere, I'm happy working with them. In the same way, if I really didn't like someone, then that would make it, I would tend to value the technical skills over whether I like someone or not, but it's still something where if I was on the fence about it, that might have an impact. And I think the one other piece that this affects, which we don't really think about, is how much an interviewer helps the candidate as they're going through the interview, and how much they do that sort of subconsciously without actually saying, I'm going to deduct points from that. Because obviously if I give someone a hint, the way that I usually think about it, personally anyway, is that each hint that I give them, depending on the magnitude of the hint, is some number of essentially imaginary points deducted from their total score. I'm not keeping an actual score, but just, it's one sort of demerit.
Yeah, sure. You have a sense of how much you've helped someone or whether they came up with the entire solution by themselves.
Exactly. And so if I had to help them a lot, that's obviously counts off a lot more. But I do think that if I really like the person, I'm more likely to subconsciously help them. I'm more likely to provide encouragement. I'm more likely to share. And if they're very communicative, I'm much more likely to discuss ideas with them and not really think of that as me giving them a hint, because that was not my intention. And so that's a much more subtle thing. And it's not something where, I'm doing it consciously, but there's just so much value in how the dynamic changes when you like the person. That again, I don't think it's the most important thing. I think people should focus on the technical skills first and foremost, because if your technical skills are great, the social part doesn't matter. But in that middle ground, it can really help you a lot.
Yeah, on the topic of collaborating with candidates, have you seen people doing pair programming in interviews? Is this something you have experience with yourself or you've heard from people?
Yeah, I remember actually I did a pair programming interview a while back with Square, I think it was, did a pair programming interview. I think that is one that I forgot to mention. I think there's more of these sort of collaborative things, which I think is a really great way to approach it. The downside of that is obviously that it is much harder for people to judge in an objective way. And so I think with things like that, it really does come probably down a lot more to how you connect with the person, how like the social skills become more important in that sort of setting, because it's not a matter of just they either got the answer or they didn't, since it's this collaboration. And so I've not conducted those, so I'm not exactly sure how people usually think about that when they are evaluating them. But just from my perspective, it would seem to be something that would be a lot more dependent on whether I like the person and whether I feel good working with them, rather than whether they are technically the most proficient person.
Yeah, that would emphasize communication skills a little bit more. And this actually nicely segues into my next question, because I was going to ask, do you typically use different types of interviews for different roles? In some roles, let's say a Scrum Master or a product owner, communication skills might be a bigger part of your job, even though it's still a technical role, than in other roles. So would you say a tester or a DevOps person, do they have different technical interviews, or is everything the same apart from the type of technical questions that you ask them?
Yeah, great question, because I do think it varies a lot. And, the more I will say as well that what we focus on is mostly with the companies that we're focusing on, they tend to be more of a generalist focus. So it's not so much that you're hiring people for specific technical roles or even for things like a Scrum Master or these different types of roles. It tends to be more like software engineer, tech lead, manager, and then maybe like DevOps and things like that. So it's a kind of more limited set of options. But with that, I do think that it's important to realize that there are different types of interviews. And so it really, what I found is that it more tends to be not that the individual type, like interview questions change, but the ratio of different types of questions. So it's like, if I'm looking at like software engineering role, purely software engineering, then I'm probably going to, if I'm a relatively junior person, I might expect 3 technical interviews or 4 technical interviews and 1 system design interview, or maybe 1 behavioral interview. And that's about it. If you're getting further along, if you're a more senior developer, you might expect multiple system design interviews. You might expect at least 1, maybe 2 behavioral interviews and fewer of the technical interviews. And so it really, I think, more tends to shift the like ratio of different types of interviews than the questions themselves within each category shift, if that makes sense. And so, and then also if you're looking at like more management type roles, obviously you can expect more of a behavioral types of questions around the management and leadership, which the way that I would think about it broadly is there are 2 things that you can do. 1, I highly recommend people go on glassdoor.com, because you can see a lot of references of people will share their interview experiences. They'll share what sorts of questions they were asked. And so it can give you a lot of context. And actually, this is going to be 3 things. 2, you can ask your recruiter what you should expect to be asked in the interview. Because the recruiter really is...
Oh, that's a great...
Yeah, because the recruiter is really a person who they benefit from you getting the job. They really want to support you, and they're really there. A lot of times people get bent out of shape about recruiters, but realize it's not because they hate you or anything. It's because they have so many candidates that they're working with. But they still have your best interest in a lot of cases. And so it's good to reach out to them and see if you can figure out more about what to expect from the recruiter. So that's number 2. And number 3, look at the role and put yourself in your interviewer's shoes and think about for a second, what would I want to see if I were the interviewer? And how can I sort of extrapolate and imagine what I would ask the person if I was in that position?
So, how aligned should interviews be to the actual job? So, we all
Huh.
know these typical answers like reverse a linked list or search through a binary tree. But who does that really in a job? So, what is your take on that? Is there like a catalog of questions that are good algorithmic questions to ask? Or should companies more align their questions with, if you're going to be a web front end developer, then the exercise should also be something like make a form with a button and it should be responsive and more like your actual job. What is your take on that?
It's kind of a loaded question, but I'll talk a little bit about it. I think that this is this is just the debate, right? This is sort of the ongoing debate that I don't think is ever going to end, because I don't think it's ever going to completely shift over to, you're doing interviews that are exactly like what you're doing in your job, because that's just not realistic. And, if you look at other industries too, I think people tend to get more bent out of shape about this in software engineering than other industries. But if you look at interviews, like, think about if you were, very simple example, interviewing for a job as a hamburger flipper at McDonald's. Your job interview is not going to involve you going and flipping hamburgers. Your interview is going to involve you like talking about yourself, right? So at a very basic level, job interviews are never going to be the same as the actual job. That being said, I do think there's value in trying to test people as well as you can in those relative skills. And so, I think that there are pros and cons to all the different approaches. And that's why a lot of people will say, oh, we'll just have people do a project, right? Have them do a quick like web development project, and then you can see whether or not they know how to do the job. And that's great in theory, but what that involves is a lot of time outside of the actual interviews for the person doing the work. You have no idea what kind of resources they used. You have no idea whether they copied the code from someone else, or whether they can actually do the job, because you're not actually there to monitor their thought process. On the flip side, there's a downside to doing the technical interviews, because obviously it is a very different skill set, and it's a kind of awkward thing that people have to learn in and of themselves, like learn completely separately from their job. The way that I tend to think about this is I need to look up what this book was, because I can never remember what the book is actually called. But there was a book that I read, and they talked about this idea of gravity problems. And a gravity problem is a problem that's like gravity, where you can complain about it all you want, but that's not going to make a bit of difference, right? I can complain about, oh, I hate gravity so much, but that's not going to mean that the more I complain doesn't make it more likely that I'm going to be able to like jump off the roof of my building and fly, right? It just is not something that's going to change. And so you have to work within the parameters that you're given. And I think as an interviewer or as an interviewee, we are working within these parameters. And so it's really a matter of learning, how can I get the best at what I'm going to have to do at actually demonstrating these skills in my interview, and not stress out about whether this is a quote unquote fair process or not. On the side of the interviewers, we should always be looking for ways that better test people. And I do think that things like pair programming or projects, or even just giving people an IDE to work with, can be really valuable tools, but you got to figure out a way to do that so that it's fair and that it's not like actually making more complexity and more difficulty for the candidates. So honestly, long answer short, there's not really a great solution, but I think that people tend to be overly negative about coding interviews and technical interviews. And it's really something where, if you think about it, in reality, it's not that different from interviews in any other profession. And it is something that is a learnable skill. And if you learn it, that sets you up really well for your career down the road. So it's something that I think is worth taking the time to learn and figure out how you can do it effectively.
Yeah, that's definitely true, of course, from the side of someone that is being interviewed. But some people in our audience might also be the people that do the interviews. And I would say from the side of the interviewer, it's not really a gravity problem, because you have full control over the things you ask within your company. So
Yes.
I totally see how you're saying that if you're an interviewee, yeah, you can complain, but you're still going to reverse the linked list. But on the side of interviewers, there, of course, it's where it gets interesting, because it's not just a matter of fairness, even though fairness is very important. It's also a matter of how well does this interview help me predict whether this person actually fits at the company, whether they would be happy, whether they would be productive. So I can see, apart from fairness, that it also might make sense if your questions reflect what a candidate is going to do, just because you get a better sense of them. Or would you say that these technical interviews, these, let's say, algorithmic questions, you think they are definitely always a good predictor for technical jobs?
From what I've seen, and I think it's an interesting question. From what I've seen, I think that the algorithmic type questions tend to be an overly restrictive measure. And so, what I would say is that for the most part, and it's obviously not 100% true, but generally speaking, if someone is good at the algorithmic interviews, I think that is a pretty good indicator that they're going to be good at the actual job as well. Because it shows that they sort of, from a thought process perspective and from a mindset perspective, have the sort of technical know-how. The downside of that, though, is that it does eliminate lots of people who might be great candidates but are not good at algorithmic questions. So I think there are a lot of people where they're not necessarily good at algorithmic questions, but they are good at software engineering. They are good at like building products and stuff. And so when you look at it, from a company's perspective, it's a very high cost for me to hire the wrong person. And so I'd prefer to have something where I accidentally weed out good candidates rather than I accidentally let in bad candidates. And so in that respect, I think that there is value in that from the company perspective. And then on the flip side, it means that as a software engineer, you have to get good at answering those types of questions. And I think that's part of the reason why it's a relatively good indicator that someone is going to be a good developer, is that you have to be strong from a technical standpoint to be able to get good at interviewing. But the reason why there are a lot of people who aren't good at interviewing is that it's a separate skill. So it's like a skill that builds on top of being a good engineer already, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it does make some sense, but I would also say that there's also some bias, of course, in this process. Because, for example, having a graduate degree, a master's degree, or a bachelor's degree in computer science will be one of the things that such interview skills build on top of. Because if you go to university and you do a computer science program, which I did in university, then you will definitely learn some of the things that they might ask in those interviews. So do you think actually it is a benefit to have a formal computer science degree? And do you agree with me that those interviews might be geared a bit towards people that have a university degree? Or do you think if you're just a good technical thinker and you have some programming skills, you can still also learn the algorithmics and it is unrelated to each other?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you that the interviews are sort of biased towards people with a degree. And I think that the problem that I see is that it's not like there's a great alternative solution. And so I'm by no means want to say that this is a great solution, but I don't think that there are, I think that the other approaches that people have come up with also have a lot of problems. And so, I do think in that respect that getting a degree can be really helpful. I was actually just speaking with a friend the other day who's considering doing a boot camp. And I think there's a lot of, you can definitely make that work as well, but it is a bit of a harder road because you're not getting that same foundation that you are necessarily getting when you're doing a computer science degree. And, it's kind of these types of interviews anyway are definitely biased towards people who have that foundation. Now, I would say as well that there are a lot of jobs that don't ask these types of questions. So it's not necessarily a requirement. And I think there are a couple great GitHub repos that I could look up, but I don't know off the top of my head, where people talk about, like, for example, jobs that don't ask coding type questions in the interview. And there are a lot of great companies that don't ask these types of questions. So if that's something where, it's really hard for you or you're really struggling, that is an option as well, is to just say, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to look at other companies.
Calling all developers. There's no telling what you can create when you upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Are you ready to build the applications you want, however you want them? Are you ready to develop applications faster than ever? Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
So you mentioned in your answer, you said, well, there are also other approaches apart from technical interviews that also have problems. And I think you mentioned one example, which is the boot camp. What would be other approaches? So consider a company that would want to maybe diversify the developers they hire and thus change something and not do the technical interviews. What are things people could use that are other approaches? And maybe also what would be their problems?
Well, so the general things that I see in terms of evaluating developers are, you have the sort of standard technical interviews, and then you have different like variations on that. So you have the pair programming, which we already talked about, is much more biased towards the social ability than it is towards the technical side. We have other sorts of interviews, like you could do like a debugging interview, or you could do perfect example is with what I mentioned earlier on is Google giving people a computer that they can use, but it's not their computer. And so it's this whole different setup. It's this whole, it can make it it can actually put you into a very uncomfortable environment that you're not familiar with. So that's, its own set of downsides. Then you also have stuff like having people do projects, which that's the other thing that I see coming up a lot is having people do some sort of project. But you run into the issue there with a couple different things. One is that you have people having to do a lot of work outside of the interview. Like I remember when I was in college, I had a company ask me to do this, and I probably spent 20 hours working on this project, like 20 hours that I basically didn't have. So that was but I really wanted the job. And so I was in a position where I was willing to do it, even though maybe I shouldn't have invested that much effort. And you also have the difficulty of grading those projects because you don't know what kind of work went in. You don't actually know. If I give someone a week to do the project and I'm like, I want someone who can do this whole thing in 4 hours, I don't know how long they spent when they were doing it on their own. And I don't know what resources they were using. I don't know what, potentially people could copy paste code from Stack Overflow and have no idea how it actually works. Right. So I'm not saying that there's necessarily that this is a wrong way to do it, but it definitely has its own set of problems. And one option that I think does have potential is bringing people on is paying people to do small projects. But the downside of that, of course, is that, it's hard for people to integrate into your platform in a short period of time. And so you're essentially paying them to do toy projects, which is expensive on the company's behalf. So there are a lot of different ways that you could approach it, but I think they all have different sorts of flaws and they all emphasize different characteristics.
Yeah, and let's go back to the technical interviews in itself and then the biases in these. A while ago, you said as an answer, like, if I give someone help, then I mentally deduct a point from their score. So, of course, people have biases, and it's very hard to do that sort of thing without unintentionally also taking into account the person that is sitting opposite you.
Yeah.
So, things that you might accidentally take into account, women you might earlier think they don't really know, they don't understand, whereas of a man you might think they know, but they just phrased it a little bit weird or something. And the same might be true for racial biases or for people with disabilities. So is there anything that you do to counter those biases within technical interviews?
So I personally have not had too much experience with that specific thing. I think that this is one of those things that is kind of a perennial issue with interviewing, no matter what kind of interviews you're doing and no matter what sort of situation. One example of people trying to address this that I've seen is interviewing.io does anonymous interviews. And so they do like online, but they're basically doing a phone screen, right? So they're doing that first round interview, but then you still have to go on site afterwards. And so it could potentially give you a good opportunity to break in to get into that on-site interview, but then you're still going to run into the same issues. So I honestly don't know. I don't think there is a great solution because just inherently, you look at, for example, this is a problem obviously that people have been trying to fix everywhere for years. Like you look at like college admissions, right? And so you had this, I think I saw an article recently or watched a video that was about Harvard admissions and the sort of racial makeup of the admissions like statistics. And there were a bunch of Asian students who were actually suing Harvard for basically being, even though the Harvard student body is made up of a disproportionate number of Asian students, they still accept them as a way lower percentage of the total applicants, because there's this skew just naturally that the, Asian students are trying to get, there are a lot of Asian students trying to get into Harvard, and a lot of really smart Asian students. And so the question is, with that, it's like, what do you do? And so Harvard, they're trying to balance things and balance people from different backgrounds, but there is no good solution. And if they were to do things the other way, if they were to say, okay, we'll take Asian students proportionally, then the African-American students would be really upset because they're getting shortchanged, or the white students would get really upset. It's kind of a zero-sum game, right? Where if one person gets it, another person doesn't. And so there's always going to be this push and pull where you can try and implement things to make it more fair to one group, but inherently by doing that, you're making it less fair to another group. And I don't know. I think this is something that people have been trying to figure out for, hundreds of years at this point, and I have no idea what the solution is.
Yeah, it is a very difficult problem in general. And of course, this is not specifically a tech problem. This is a hiring problem in general. But tech just tends to have already a very biased population, so that or a skewed population towards certain categories. So that might increase the problem, because then that's what people, if people think about a computer nerd or about a programmer, then they might have a specific person in mind.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's move on to a lighter topic. So you have yourself done a bunch of interviews, and before the show, you told me that you might have some failures to share with people, and maybe also some lessons learned from failures in interviews. So is there any cool story you could tell that is funny now about interviews that you failed at?
Yeah, I definitely failed my fair share of interviews. And I think the one that I can laugh about the best is probably the very first interview that I ever did. It was my freshman year of college. So I'd basically taken half of Intro to Computer Science. And I had an interview with Microsoft. So they were doing interviews on campus, and I went in, and the guy was kind of intimidating. I'd never done anything like this before. Before the interview, I had picked up Cracking the Coding interview, and I looked through it, and I was like, half of this stuff is stuff that I have never heard of before. And then I think I went in, and he asked me to describe to him an array or something super simple, and I was like, what's an array? Like, it was the most basic level problem, and I just had no clue. So that was, obviously I did not get the internship at that point. And it was, it was one of those things where obviously I was in this position where I did not have the background, but I think that, a lot of times we do end up in this situation where we tend to be so hard on ourselves. And I like to realize that, we're all coming from somewhere, and they're all learning experiences, right? So that was a great position where I was in this experience, and I was like, holy crap, I had no idea what to do. So now how do I improve for the future? How do I move ahead for my future interviews, rather than getting bent out of shape and saying, oh, well, I failed this one interview, and so I'm never going to be successful.
Yeah, that's a good lesson in general. I think that if you fail an interview, it might also just be the fit between you and that company at that point. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are bad at programming.
I want to highlight something you just said as well, because you said it might not be a good fit at that point. And I think that's actually one of the...
You know what arrays are now.
Yeah. But that's one of the biggest lessons that I would take away from this in general, because it's I see a lot of people where they are hesitant to interview at all because they're like, this is my one shot. And
yeah,
a lot of times it's something more subtle. It's not something like they don't know what an array is. I assume most people who are interviewing do. But it's a matter of saying, maybe I wasn't as prepared for the interviews and I didn't do as well as I wanted to, but that does not mean that you get blacklisted from the company. So I interviewed at Google my senior year of college and did not get in. And then about 9 months later, I had a recruiter reach out to me again and be like, hey, do you want to interview again? And then I interviewed again and went through that process. And then I did not end up doing that. And then 9 months later, someone reached out to me again. And it's been now I'm actually not looking for software engineering jobs because I'm really focused on running my company. But I'm constantly getting reached out to from recruiters who are at companies where I had previously failed interviews. And so it's so much better for you to actually go out and put yourself out there and go through the process and then realize maybe I did well, maybe I didn't, but you never know until you actually go through the process. And I think so many people waste so much time just studying and studying and studying and studying because they don't feel 100% ready, that they never actually go and do the interview. And maybe 6 months ago, you could have gone in and done the interview successfully, but you weren't feeling confident about it. And so you just didn't do it.
Yeah, and also every interview is also a learning opportunity. So if you don't get the job, then at least you get another insight in what type of questions are asked, what
Exactly.
people, the whole process. So it's also a matter of just embracing failure as learning motivation, I guess.
Yeah, 1,000%, because you don't know what to expect until you've actually gone and done the process. And that's also why I recommend people do mock interviews leading up to your real interview, or do interviews at companies that you're less excited about first. And then you can go and do interviews at, your dream company after you've had a chance to do some other interviews and get prepared and get to start to understand that process.
That's actually already the answer to the question I was going to ask you, because I wanted to ask you, how do people get better at interviews? And I think you already mentioned two things: practice mock interviews and also just interview at companies you're not super excited about. What would your other tips be for people to practice this interview? And even maybe let's zoom into this mock interview a bit more. Like, who does a mock interview with me if I want to apply? My friends, another company? How does that mock interview process work, and what other tips do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is really my bread and butter, is helping people to prepare for these interviews. And so there are a couple things that, I'll share with you a couple of the different things that, we've really been thinking about recently. So the first is, I generally like to think about interview prep broadly as what I call the 3 pillars of interviewing. And so the 3 pillars of interviewing basically breaks down into the CS fundamentals, the strategy, and building your self-confidence, and sort of by extension, your social skills and ability to interact with people in the interview. And so the reason why I sort of lay these out is I think that if you just focus on these 3 things, that's going to get you 80 to 90% of the way there. Because if you think about it, for starters, knowing those data structures and algorithms is so important. It's like we were talking about how there's a bias towards people who have a computer science degree, right? Because you've studied those things before. And I think about it I love to use sports analogies, because it just, not because I actually like sports that much, but because it just parallels so well. So if you think about playing, basketball, before you can apply some crazy strategy, you got to learn how to dribble the ball. You got to learn how to shoot. You got to learn how to pass. You got to learn these basic skills, right? And then those sort of make up the actual basketball game. So with coding interviews, that's learning all of those basics, data structures and algorithms that sort of underlie everything else. And a great, easy resource for that, I really like Cracking the Coding Interview. If you own a copy of it, that's great. If you don't own a copy, you can literally go on Amazon.com and go to the table of contents. Go to the thing where you can look inside the book. Go to the table of contents and you can see exactly what topics you need to study. So that's a great, quick, easy resource there.
But also, if you value people's work, just buy their books.
Yes, absolutely. I do think you should buy the book, no question. But if you're not going to buy the book for whatever reason, you can still benefit from at least the table of contents.
Fair enough. Is there anything else that we could do? Read the book, practice interviews. Any other tips to really nail that interview, maybe before you go apply at the company you're really excited about and you actually want to work?
Well, so I think the other 2 big things that are super important with this are being strategic, number 1. So being strategic, when I work with a lot of people, the general approach that people take to interview prep, and for everyone listening out there, just take a moment and think if this is you or not, is that you go into the interview and you basically say, I hope that I either see a problem that I've already seen before, or that I'm going to be able to look at the problem and immediately see a solution. And that's sort of the standard way that people approach this. But the problem with that is that leaves a lot of room for error. Because if you go into the interview, you basically are setting up this dichotomy where it's either I see the solution to the problem or I don't see the solution to the problem. And so what I really want to encourage people to think about is, how can I be more strategic about how I'm approaching the problems? How can I make sure that I have a sort of framework that I can use to tackle these problems regardless of whether I've seen them before. So the basic framework that I recommend to people is, start with finding that brute force solution to the problem. Don't worry about finding an optimal solution. Start by finding that brute force solution. Then kind of take a stepwise process of optimizing it. So like in Cracking the Coding interview, she talks about the BUD optimization strategy, which is bottlenecks, unused code, and duplicated work. And those are sort of things to look for in your code to start optimizing it. And then only at that point do you actually go and write the code in your interview. And then finally, you got to test the code as well. So just even, I can go into so much more detail about the individual steps of the framework, but at a high level, just having that step-by-step process of this is how I'm going to approach the problem when I go into the interview makes such a huge difference. And then the third thing was, of course, the social skills, which, and the building that confidence, which that's really where the things that we were talking about, the mock interviews, doing interviews at companies you're less excited about. There are a couple great resources for mock interviews. So one, highly encourage you, find a friend and do like partner up. You can mock interview them, they can mock interview you. Really easy solution. There's also pramp.com, which facilitates free peer-to-peer mock interviews. And I think if you go to bytebybyte.com/pramp, you can also get, we have a thing with them where you'll get unlimited credits. And so you can do as many mock interviews as you want. There are pros and cons to it because obviously it's peer-to-peer, so you're not necessarily going to get the best feedback because you're working with someone else who is also learning. But it's a great opportunity for you to also put yourself in the shoes of the interviewer and get experience doing that. And then interviewing.io as well is a great resource if you are slightly more senior. So I know that they're primarily looking for people who are in a slightly more senior development position, like 4 or 5 years or more of experience. But if you're in that demographic, that's a really good resource as well. So those are a couple ways that you can actually get that practice.
We will definitely add those links to the show notes. And let's now move on to the side of the interviewer that you just hinted at already. Imagine if you do this peer-to-peer thing, you will imagine that you are the interviewer. So do you also have some best practices for people that do interviews? Many of our listeners might actually sometimes be involved or actually do themselves entirely the technical interviews from the interviewer perspective. How do you get better at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start by saying, let's get really meta about this. And just like I said, imagine that as an interviewee, imagine putting yourself in the position of the interviewer. As an interviewer, you want to imagine yourself in the position of the interviewee, right? So you want to understand, like, what is the perception of the person coming in? How do I make them comfortable? How do I set up a situation that is going to be better for them? So like right off the bat, a couple things. And this is also partially from my experience. I've had a lot of bad interviews where I've been the interviewee and the interviewer has done something that's really made me feel uncomfortable or made me have trouble in the interview. So a couple things that I would say right off the bat are, one, make sure that you try and be warm and friendly with the person as you can. A lot of interviewees are super nervous coming in. They're not feeling comfortable. Talk to them, have a little bit of small talk conversation, make sure that they're feeling comfortable if they need water or coffee or a bathroom break or whatever. Because a lot of times when you're doing interviews, it's like they're doing 4 or 5 interviews in a row and you're just coming in here for the hour or whatever, but they've been like doing these back to back to back. And so they're going to be kind of fried potentially when they get to you. So a couple things like that, making that little bit of small talk. One thing that I would recommend that some people do and some people don't, is ask the same question to all of your interviewees. Because when you ask the same question, it allows you to not only evaluate people in a more objective way, because everyone is doing the same work, and so you can compare them better. It also is going to it's going to give you a much better sense of like, what are the sort of ins and outs of the problem? What are the things that people tend to get tripped up on? You kind of have this like bank of hints that you're able to give people depending on where they get stuck. And so I think that can be really helpful. And when you're choosing the problem as well, one thing that I really, really like and makes your life so much easier as an interviewer is do a multi-part problem where the first part's really easy. So if you do a multi-part problem where the first part is easy, this accomplishes 2 things. One, is it helps your interviewee feel a little bit more comfortable as they're going through, because they can get that quick win early on, and so it'll help them to like loosen up a bit more and free them up to really show you what they can do. And then second of all, it makes it so that if you have someone come in who's clearly just not good at this and is not figuring it out, I like having a problem where if they get stuck for 45 minutes on the easy part of the problem, at the end, we can walk through the solution together and they feel good about it. Because I don't want it to...
Oh, that's really nice.
Right, like I've had cases where I've gotten to the end of the interview and they're like totally stuck. And I'm like, oh, let's talk through this together. And I try and explain it and it's still just going completely over their head. And that always just feels like crap. So I really try to avoid that. And then the other thing that when you do a multi-part problem is that once you get through that first part, I like to give them, and this is again my personal preference, I like to give them a problem or a second part of the problem that's open-ended and does not have oftentimes I like one that doesn't have like a singular optimal solution. Because what I think is most valuable is let's have a discussion. It comes more to the pair programming side of things. It's like, let's discuss the trade-offs here. Let's discuss like how we might, weigh our different options and figure out what is the best solution here. And if you pick something that's kind of open-ended and doesn't necessarily have a single optimal solution, that facilitates a lot more conversation and a lot more discussion, which I think can get really interesting. Especially that's where you can start to see where candidates can start to shine, really, because you can it's like when you can start to have a deeper technical conversation with them and they already did the first part. They already validated for you that they have the basic technical skills. Now let's dig deeper and like see how far we can push things.
Nice. Those are such considerate tips that it really seems that as an interviewer, you are thinking about also a good experience for someone that's being interviewed to help them maybe try such an interview again at a next company. I think that's very, very valuable.
I do think that's really, really important. And I think that that's something that, interviewing can often be, it's something that kind of gets thrown in your lap as a distraction from what you're normally doing. But it also makes it a more fun experience for both of you if you just take a little bit of time to think about how can I make this an enjoyable experience for both of us.
Nice. So we just talked about failure from the interviewee, Sam. Is there also a nice interviewer, Sam, failure story that you have to share where just like from the second the interviewee came in, you're like, oh, they don't have an understanding of what this job was all about, or just it was a mismatch and you had to sort of abort or pull someone through. I think you sort of hinted at this already.
Yeah.
When you said at one point you gave someone a complicated exercise and you explained the answer and then still they didn't get it, which clearly is not really a great experience. Do you have any other interviewers and failure stories?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of where I was thinking when you asked this question. I think, one of my favorite sorts of questions to ask is like a basic recursion question. So for example, come up with like a power set or come up with all the combinations of a series of inputs. And so if you understand recursion, it's fairly straightforward. It's a pretty easy thing to do. And it's also, just side note, if you're going to be interviewing and you're going to study recursion, that is the one thing, if you just know how to do that, super, super useful. So side note, but I think I was working with a client. And so this was the first time that I had done a mock interview with them or anything. And I asked them this question and they were like totally stumped because they obviously didn't really have much recursion experience in this case. And I just felt terrible because this is a new client that I'm working with. And so now I'm putting them in this position where they feel like a total idiot. And I'm like, this is completely my fault. And so I shifted after that point to say, again, basically what I was saying is in that case, I would just ask them two separate questions, but ask them an easy question first. And then only once they get through that, then let's say, okay, you did great on this beginner question. Now let's get into the meat. And if you struggle with this, well, at least we have an idea of, you're somewhere between point A and point B, rather than we just have no idea because I just asked you a question that was really hard and made you totally demoralized about your whole process of preparing for your interviews.
Oh, So we briefly talked about this in the beginning of the interviews, I think, where you said, oh, sometimes also within interviews, people do debugging or testing. And I want to zoom in that a little bit more as the final topic of this episode.
Yeah, for sure.
Typically, those algorithmic questions are very much aimed at creating an algorithm. So give me the algorithm or give me the code for doing such and such. I can imagine it is also interesting to know or important to know if a candidate can debug an algorithm, for example. Is this something where people say, here is code with a bug in it, find the code? Or here is code that doesn't have tests, write some sensible tests, and using the tests, try to find the bug?
Yeah, so my old company that I used to work for did exactly the first thing that you said, is they would give you an actual program, and it had, I think, 4 or 5 specific bugs in it. And the idea was basically they wanted you to use all the tools available to you to identify what those bugs were and fix it so that it would run properly. And so it's really, with that sort of problem, it was really about how do you be systematic about this? Because I think a lot of times we'll jump in and, even I know I do this for my own code a lot of the time when I'm testing. I wrote something and I'm like, why isn't it working? I just kind of read through the code and stare at it a little bit and think about it and wonder, why the programming gods are not favoring me today. And it doesn't actually help me figure out what's wrong. And so I tend to go through like the, 8 stages of grief or whatever it is. And then ultimately I finally get to the acceptance of I need to write some tests and actually test this thing. But that's really what I think in the debugging interview, specifically in that sort of interview, you really want to be able to jump straight to that and say, okay, I'm going to be strategic about this. I'm going to, for instance, let's figure out where I can set, 5 different breakpoints in this code. Where are going to be the breakpoints? What am I going to expect the data to be? And so you can start, very quickly start to narrow stuff down and figure out, okay, well, what function is incorrect? Or write basic unit tests, right? There are a lot of ways that you can approach it, but it's really about being strategic and about, using the tools available to you. So like in that case, I believe we were using Eclipse. And so it's one of those cases where it is a matter of you kind of need to understand the IDE at least at a basic level. Because in that case, I was programming in Java. So we were using Eclipse for that. But I mean, if I had questions about specifics of like, how do I create a breakpoint? That's not really the question at stake. It's like, I would expect as the interviewer to give people that sort of feedback, especially if they haven't used the tool before. Yeah. So it's basically like that would be one type of interview. I think if you're looking at more of a QA or testing role, I've not actually seen this, but I would not be surprised if someone asked you to write a series of, unit tests or integration tests or something for a piece of code. Because I think that would be a really good interview if that is more of the job that you're looking at.
Yeah, so then we're back to the alignment between what you do and what your job will be. If you're going to be a tester, then writing tests actually might make lots of sense, maybe more than writing code.
Yeah, and that's also something I think that with testing, it's a little bit more objective. And there's here's the thing is that with testing, if I say, okay, I want you to write tests that will give me 90% coverage, then that's a very easily measurable thing, right? I can literally use a tool to measure my test coverage. Or I can say, there are a series of bugs in here. And so how many of those bugs are these tests catching? And then, there's some subjective stuff like, are they clean? Are they easy to read? Are they, maintainable? Stuff like that. But at a very simple level, I think writing tests is something that's a lot more objective. And so that would make it potentially a really good way to test someone in that sort of situation.
Great. So those were all the questions that I had for you today. The final question we always ask people on the show is, where can we find out more about you and about the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my website's byte-by-byte.com. It's byte-by-byte.com. And we do have a couple resources that people might find interesting. If you go to byte-by-byte.com/50 questions, you can download. We have a guide of 50 of the most common coding interview questions that you can download. And we have like video walkthroughs of all of those. And as you mentioned at the beginning, we also have a ebook on dynamic programming that is free as well. So if people want to go to, that's just dynamicprogrammingbook.com. So those would be great resources. You can also find me on YouTube, actually. We do a lot of YouTube videos. So you can just search for Byte by Byte on YouTube and that'll come up. But that would be, I'd love to connect with anyone who listens to this and would like to learn more, because definitely, we're here to help if you're preparing for your coding interviews in any way.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure that the YouTube and your own website and the ebook and the 50 questions, that those are all in the show notes. So if people are interested, they can easily find it through our website.
Perfect.
So thanks so much for being on the show today, Sam.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language, choose your tools, choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.